In the autumn of 1889, the town of Grover's Hollow, Nevada, watched a dead man's property go to auction for the price of a dinner and did not think twice about it. The Harwick mansion sat on 3 acres at the north end of Copper Street, and it had sat empty for 11 months by the time the probate court finally posted the notice. Elias Harwick had been one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties when his heart stopped at his own supper table, and his heirs, 2 nephews in Sacramento who had never set foot in Nevada, refused to take possession of a property they called a liability. No water rights worth holding, no mine claim attached, just the house, the grounds, and whatever was in them, going fast because the county wanted its back taxes, and the nephews wanted nothing to do with the errand of collecting them. That was how Nora Vance came to stand in the cold morning light outside the probate office on a Thursday in October, reading the auction notice twice to make certain she had understood it correctly. She was 26 years old. She had arrived in Grover's Hollow 8 weeks earlier with $41, a leather satchel containing her father's tools, and a trade that most men in the territory had never seen a woman hold. Her father, Owen Vance, had been a stonemason and a builder of fine cellars, specifically the vaulted stone and mortar kind the old European families favored, the kind with fitted keystones and drainage channels cut by hand into the floor. He had learned the craft from his own father in Pennsylvania and had spent 30 years refining it across 4 western territories. He had died of a fever in Elko in the spring, and Nora had buried him with what she had, settled what she could, and moved west with the tools and the knowledge because there was nothing else left to move with. Her father had begun teaching her when she was 9 years old, which in his view was the correct age to start. He said that stonework was not something you could learn in a year or 2 and then apply. It accumulated the way mortar cured, slowly, under pressure, becoming something harder and more permanent than its components suggested. He taught her to mix mortar by feel before he taught her to measure it, because he said the numbers were only a codification of what your hands already knew. He taught her to read the face of a stone for grain and fault before he taught her to dress it, because a stone cut wrong along its grain would fail regardless of how well it was laid. He taught her to listen to the sound of her mallet against a set stone, because sound told you what your eyes could not see. She had worked beside him on every significant project of his final 15 years. By the time he died, she knew his trade as completely as he had known it, which meant she knew it well enough to understand how much remained to learn. She had found work enough in Grover's Hollow to keep herself fed, pointing mortar on a church foundation and repairing a crumbling retaining wall for a livery stable on the South Road. The work had been steady but small. The tools in her satchel were capable of finer things than that, and she knew it. She had taken the small work without complaint, because small work was still work, and the alternative was to have no work at all, and she did not intend to be in that position. She folded the auction notice and put it in her coat pocket. She had walked the Harwick property twice in the preceding week, once in the early morning when the light was neutral, and once in the afternoon when the shadows showed the structural lines most clearly. The house itself was sound in the main, though neglected. The east wall had settled at the northeast corner, as she could see from the differential cracking in the above-grade stonework, and the soft ground at that corner indicated a drainage problem that had worsened the settling over time. These were not insignificant repairs. The men at the auction were not entirely wrong in their assessments. What they had not done, or had not thought to do, was go to the cellar entrance. She had stood at the top of the cellar steps on her second walk and held her lantern low over the threshold and looked at the floor below. What the lantern light had found was the beginning of a floor that was not dirt and was not plain mortar. It was something cut and fitted and old and executed with a precision she recognized immediately from her father's teaching as the signature of serious work. Serious work built for a purpose. She had not gone in that day. She had stood at the threshold for a long moment, holding the light, and then she had turned and walked back to town. Her father had shown her only a few vaults of that particular construction in her years of working beside him. He had called them estate cellars, and he had said they were built by men who had a reason to build something that would last long past their own names. The kind of vault that cost real money and real skill and was not built for the storage of potatoes or the aging of wine, though it could serve both functions, but for the preservation of something the builder considered worth preserving. She walked back to the boarding house where she was staying, packed her satchel, and told the landlady she would be moving to her own address by nightfall. The bidding was held on the front steps of the probate office at 10 in the morning, attended by a dozen men and no other women. The county clerk read the lot aloud in a flat voice. The Horrick property at the north end of Copper Street. 3 acres, the main structure and all outbuildings. Contents as found. Minimum bid established at $4, representing the outstanding tax balance on the parcel, per the decree of the court. The men on the steps did not stir. One of them, a mine supervisor named Garrett, spoke up to say that the place had a bad foundation. Everyone knew it, and the house would have to come down before anyone could build fresh. Another man agreed. A third said the cellar took on water every spring and the whole lower level was a loss. A fourth asked what the point of the thing was, as there were no mineral rights attached, and the ground was not farmable at that elevation. Nora raised her hand and said $4. There was a pause, and then there was laughter. The comfortable laughter of men who find a woman's presumption amusing, rather than threatening. One of them turned to look at her and asked if she planned to carry it home in her apron. Another said she had better have big pockets. The clerk asked, without particular warmth, if she had the $4 present. She set them on the table in front of him, $2 in coin and 2 in paper. He looked at the money, looked at her, and stamped the deed. She did not respond to the laughter. She picked up the deed and folded it into the same pocket as the notice, and she walked north on Copper Street toward the house she had just purchased for the price of a dinner. What she carried from that auction was not triumph. It was a task. She understood the difference. If there is one thing this story asks of you, it is patience. The answer to what Elias Harwick sealed beneath his house did not come in a single afternoon, or a single week, or without the particular kind of labor that most people will not perform, because they are looking for a quicker way to the truth. Stay with it. She spent the first day clearing the cellar entrance. The door was exterior, set into the north face of the house's stone foundation, and it had been padlocked from the outside with a chain that had rusted almost through. She cut the chain with a cold chisel and hammer, working steadily and without impatience, and pulled the door open against the resistance of swollen wood and accumulated debris on the threshold. 11 months of Nevada weather had driven grit into every gap. She cleared the threshold with a flat shovel and stood the door open with a stone to let the interior breathe. The smell that came out was old air, the kind her father had taught her to recognize as the signature of a sealed space, cold and still, with a mineral undertone she associated with good mortar and dry stone, not rot. Not the sour green smell of water damage. The water trouble the men on the probate steps had described was real, but it was confined to the northeast corner of the structure, just as the settling pattern above ground suggested, and it had not penetrated the main vault. She registered this as a fact and moved on. She stepped inside with the lantern held high. The cellar was larger than the footprint of the house suggested it would be. 14 feet wide by perhaps 22 feet deep, she estimated, with a barrel vault overhead that was intact along its full length. The vault was constructed of a pale, buff-colored sandstone dressed into smooth voussoirs, the wedge-shaped units that lock a barrel vault into compression, and the dressing was fine enough that you could not have fit a card between the joints. Whoever had built this vault had not been working to a minimum standard. The floor was what she had glimpsed from the threshold. Fitted stone, large, irregular flags of a blue-gray granite, dry-laid with tight joints and a slight fall toward a central channel that ran the length of the floor to a drain in the far wall. The channel was clean, no sediment, no debris. Either the drain still functioned correctly, or the space had been sealed before any material could accumulate. She could not yet tell which. She set the lantern on the floor and knelt at the nearest stone joint and pressed her thumbnail along the mortar line. The mortar was hard. There was no give, no dust, no spalling at the edges. Whoever had laid this floor had mixed the mortar to the correct consistency and had let it cure fully before it was ever loaded. 25 years at minimum, she estimated, given the mineral hardness. Possibly closer to 30. Her father had told her that good lime mortar reached its ultimate strength at about 25 years, and then stayed there, essentially forever, as long as it was not exposed to freezing water. This mortar was there. She sat back on her heels and looked at the vault from one end to the other. Her father had built 2 cellars in his life that she would call fine work, the kind of work a craftsman makes when someone pays him what the craft actually costs and gives him the time to do it correctly. He had told her once, on a cold morning in Utah while they were waiting for mortar to reach the right temperature to work, that fine work was always built for a reason. Not sentiment, not habit, not because the client liked the look of cut stone. Fine work was built when someone intended to put something in it worth the cost of the building. You did not engage a skilled mason to build a fine cellar and then store turnips in it. She took her notebook from her satchel and began to sketch the floor. The survey took the better part of 2 days because she did it properly. She measured each flag with a folding rule and recorded the dimensions in her notebook, noting the shape and approximate weight of each stone, the direction of any visible grain, and the condition of the surrounding joints. She numbered the joints and noted the condition of each in a simple code she had developed working beside her father, a 1 for clean and solid, a 2 for slightly open, a 3 for spalled or deteriorated. The floor ran almost entirely 1s. 2 joints near the north wall were 2s. She marked these and continued. She mapped the drain channel and measured its fall by setting a small glass vial of water in the channel at the far end and watching which direction the bubble moved. The fall was toward the drain, as intended. She measured the fall at approximately half an inch in 20 feet, which was neither steep nor shallow, but exactly correct for a drainage channel meant to move water reliably without creating turbulence. Then she tapped each stone with the wooden mallet her father had used for 40 years, the one with the cracked face that he had refused to replace because it had the right feel, the right weight in the swing. She tapped each flag twice in its center and once near each edge, listening to the return. Most of the flags rang solid, a clear, short report that indicated good contact with the substrate beneath. 2 flags near the south wall returned a different sound. Slightly flatter, a subtle difference that lasted only a fraction of a second before it resolved, but it was there, and she was certain of what it indicated. She marked those 2 flags in her notebook with a different mark from the ones she used for joint condition. A small circle. She dated the entry and closed the notebook. Nora was not a woman who moved fast in the presence of something she did not yet understand. Speed was for men who were afraid the opportunity would close before they could grab it. Her father had said that patience was not a virtue, but a skill, meaning you had to practice it the way you practiced anything with your hands, deliberately and repeatedly, until it became the natural way to approach a problem. Few people ever learned it because they would rather be wrong quickly than right slowly. He had said this often enough that she had stopped hearing the words themselves and simply moved at the pace the work required. She went to the county records office the following morning and asked to see the building permits for the Harwick property, covering the period from 1860 onward. The clerk, a thin man named Poole who wore the expression of a person perpetually operating under inconvenience, informed her that permit records were public and she could look at them without his assistance. She thanked him and looked at them without his assistance for the better part of 3 hours. The main house had been built in 1864, which was consistent with what she could see in the structure itself. The timber framing, the window proportions, the period hardware on the doors. The cellar was a separate permit, issued in 1861, 3 years before the house. That was unusual. You built the cellar as part of the house. You did not build a cellar in a vacant field and then wait 3 years to build the house above it, unless the cellar was itself the point of the construction and the house was simply the structure that would eventually be placed over it to give it legitimacy. The contractor listed on the 1861 permit was a firm called Farris & Sons, with an address in Carson City that no longer appeared in any current directory she could find. The permit listed the scope of work as foundation and below-grade construction, which was accurate in the sense that it was technically true, and described nothing of substance. She noted everything in her notebook and asked Poole, as pleasantly as she could manage, whether the county kept records of business registrations from the 1860s. He told her it depended on what kind of records she meant and what county she was looking in, and she thanked him and left. She found what she needed, not in a county office, but in the back room of the Grover's Hollow Courier, where a woman named Etta Marsh had worked as a typesetter for 22 years and had kept every issue of the paper bound and cataloged by year in a system that was her own creation and which she maintained with a precision that put most institutional archives to shame. Etta was small and deliberate, with ink permanently worked into the whorls of her fingertips and a pair of reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead in a position that suggested they were there for reference rather than use. She received Nora's inquiry without surprise or condescension, which Nora noted as a quality she found uncommon and appreciated. It would have been the summer of 1861, Nora told her, a construction project at the north end of Copper Street, a cellar built before the house. Etta went into the back room and returned in 15 minutes with the bound volume for 1861 tucked under one arm and the volume for 1860 under the other. She set them both on the counter and opened the 1861 volume to August. There was a brief notice in the August 14th edition, 4 lines in the business column, reporting that a Mr. Elias Harwick, identified as a partner in the Consolidated Silver concern, had broken ground on a property at the north end of Copper Street and intended to build a private residence the following year. No further detail. No mention of cost. No mention of the contractor. No mention of what was being built below the future foundation. Nora read the notice twice, then turned the pages forward. In the October 3rd edition, a short notice of a fire at the Consolidated Silver assay offices on the South Road. No injuries. Records destroyed. In the same edition, a notice that the partnership of Consolidated Silver had been dissolved by mutual agreement of the partners. No explanation. No statement from either party. Etta was watching from the doorway to the back room with the quiet attention of a woman who read people the same way she read type, noting what was present and taking equal measure of what was absent. Nora asked if there had been anything else in the paper about the dissolution, any public dispute or correspondence. Etta said there had been a dispute in her recollection, though the paper at that time had not covered it as thoroughly as it might have. There had been two partners in Consolidated Silver, Elias Harwick and a man named Roland Ash. When the partnership dissolved, Ash had left Nevada and had not returned. The fire at the assay offices had destroyed the production records from the partnership's final season, and without those records, no one had been able to establish what was owed to either party from the final months of operation. There had been no legal resolution. She paused. She said that Roland Ash had died in Utah in 1874, leaving a daughter. The daughter, as far as Etta knew, still lived in the territory. A woman named Clara, who had married a homesteader named Draper and kept a place just east of town. Nora wrote the name carefully in her notebook, thanked Etta Marsh with the full attention that thanks required when you meant them, and walked back to the house on Copper Street. The two flags near the south wall came up on the third day. She had spent the previous afternoon sharpening her pointing chisel to the correct edge, because a dull chisel in close joint work cut wrong and damaged the adjacent stone, and the flags in that cellar did not deserve to be damaged. Her father had showed her how to sharpen the pointing chisel at the correct bevel, steeper than a wood chisel, and how to test the edge by drawing it lightly across the back of her thumbnail to feel the grab. The edge was right. She worked from the perimeter of each flag inward, cutting the original mortar with the chisel set at approximately 20 degrees off the surface. The hammer used with a loose wrist, so the force went into the joint and not into the stone face. Her father had taught her this angle precisely, and she held it precisely. The mortar was old and hard, and it did not come easily. She worked for 4 hours before the first flag was free to move. The joint cleared on all 4 sides to a depth of 2 inches, the flag isolated from its neighbors. It weighed approximately 30 pounds, and she lifted it with both hands, rotating it to keep the center of mass close to her body as he had taught her, and set it face up on the clear floor to one side. Beneath the first flag was packed earth fill, and set into that fill, its lid just below the surface of the surrounding substrate, was a wooden case, flat-lidded, iron-banded, perhaps 12 inches square and 6 inches deep. She did not touch it. She cleared the second flag first. The second flag came up in another 2 hours. The same careful work, the same slow clearing of the joint. Beneath it was a second case, identical in size and construction to the first. She sat on the cellar floor with her back against the south wall and looked at the 2 openings and the cases set into them. The lantern light moved slightly in the draft from the open door. The stone around her was cold and still, and the air in the vault was exactly as it had been when she first stepped in, which meant the seal had been effective for the entire life of the floor. Her father had said that fine work was built for a reason. She took both cases out of the ground carefully, setting each on the flagstone floor in the lantern light. The wood was dense and dry, cedar by the smell of it, and it had not taken on moisture. The iron bands were oxidized to a dull brown, but they were intact and the wood beneath them was sound. The lids were held by iron latches, not locked. She looked at the latches for a moment. An unlocked case was either a sign of confidence that no one would ever reach it, or a sign of a man who believed his own arrangements were so complete that a lock was unnecessary. She opened the first one. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had been folded carefully and sealed at the edges with a waxy compound to exclude any moisture, were ledgers. 4 of them, small, the covers of stiff board, each marked in faded ink with the words Consolidated Silver and a year on each spine. The years 1859, 1860, 1861, and a 4th that bore 2 years, 1861 and 1862, with a red slash through the second year, and the notation final in a different hand from the others. She opened the 1861 ledger to the center and set it on her knee. The handwriting was fine and careful, each entry made with a consistent pressure that suggested a man who had done this accounting regularly rather than reluctantly. The columns were ruled by hand in red ink. Production tallies on the left, costs in the center, distributions on the right. The right-hand page of each spread was headed with the partner's name. The left-hand page was headed E.H. The distributions on the right-hand page under the heading R. Ash, Partner, ran cleanly through July of 1861. They stopped in August. The last entry was dated August 4th. Below it, someone had drawn a single horizontal line in a heavier, blacker ink, clearly added after the entry above was written, and below that line the page was blank for the remainder of the ledger. She opened the second case. Inside the oilcloth were papers, correspondence, folded and pressed flat, each sheet dated and addressed from E. Harwick to a legal firm in San Francisco, whose name appeared 3 times across 4 letters. She set the papers on her knee beside the open ledger and read them in order. The letters were not confessional. They were the letters of a careful man managing a situation. The first, dated August 12th of 1861, discussed the fire at the assay offices as a misfortune and noted that the production records for the spring and summer season had been lost in it. The second, dated August 19th, discussed the practical difficulties of settling a partnership when records were unavailable and noted that the dissolution had been agreed to by both parties. The third, dated September 3rd, discussed the legal question of what could be demanded without documentary evidence of production, and noted the attorney's response in paraphrase, that without the production records no third party could establish what the final season's output had been, and without that figure no distribution could be compelled. The fourth letter, dated September 17th, was shorter than the others. It contained one sentence that was not about legal procedure. It said that the matter was concluded satisfactorily, and he did not expect it to be raised again. Nora set the letters down and looked at the ledger. The production tallies for the spring and summer of 1861 ran from March through the 1st of August. She added the figures across each month, working the arithmetic twice to be certain. The total for the period was $9,240 in silver recovered, valued at the assay rate noted in the left margin. Under the partnership terms recorded in the first ledger from 1859, each partner held an equal share of all production, $4,620. That was what the 1861 ledger said Roland Ash was owed from the final season of Consolidated Silver. The figure that did not appear anywhere in the distribution column, the figure below the horizontal line where the entries stopped, the records that would have shown this figure to a court or an attorney had burned in the fire at the assay offices in October of 1861. 2 months after the final entry in these ledgers, and 2 months after the letter that said the matter was concluded satisfactorily, the records had not all burned. These had not burned. They were here, below the fitted stone floor of a vault built the same year, in cases sealed against moisture and time, by a man who understood exactly what he was preserving and why he was putting it where no one would think to look. Nora sat with that for a long moment. The lantern burned. The air in the vault was cold and still. There are some things a person does without deliberating. She covered both cases with the oilcloth, gathered them under her arm, and carried them up the cellar stairs and into the kitchen of the house, where the afternoon light through the west window was sufficient to read by without straining the eyes. She spent the rest of that day with the ledgers and the correspondence spread on the kitchen table, making careful notes in her own notebook, checking her arithmetic, and copying out by hand the entries she considered most significant, which took her 3 attempts to do without error because her hands were not entirely steady the first 2 times. When she was satisfied that she had understood correctly and that the numbers were consistent, she gathered the papers, replaced them in their cases, and covered the cases with a cloth she found in the kitchen press. She went to find Clara Draper the following morning. The homestead east of town was small and well-maintained, with a kitchen garden still showing the remnant stalks of the summer's vegetables, and a woodpile stacked with a precision that told you something about the person who had stacked it. Clara Draper answered the door herself. She was a woman perhaps 10 years older than Nora, with a composed and evaluating look, the look of someone who had learned to assess a stranger in the first few seconds and reserve judgment only as long as the stranger continued to deserve it. Nora told her directly at the door what she had found and what she believed it meant. She said it plainly without preamble because she thought Clara was a person who would prefer plain speech to preparation. She laid out the ledgers, the correspondence, the arithmetic, and the connection to Roland Ashe in the order in which she had discovered them, which was also the order in which they made logical sense. She told Clara that her father's share of the final season of Consolidated Silver had not been paid to him. The records that could have proved that were concealed in the cellar of the man who owed the debt. I found them because I know what to look for in a floor, she said. Clara stood in the doorway and listened without speaking. When Nora finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My father believed until the end that the records had been burned. He did not pursue it because there was nothing to pursue without the records." Nora said, "The records were not burned." Clara asked if she could see them. Nora said yes, and they walked back to the house on Copper Street together in the thinning afternoon light. They sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers open between them for 2 hours. Clara could read the handwriting on the distribution pages because some of the entries were in her father's hand, the ones that represented his confirmation of the amounts, written in a narrower script that she traced with one finger without pressing. She went through the 1859 ledger and the 1860 ledger and the 1861 ledger in order, and she did not speak while she read. She reached the horizontal line in heavy ink and the blank page below it, and her fingers stopped. She kept her hand flat on the page for a moment. Then she closed the ledger and sat with her hands in her lap. Nora told her she would need a lawyer. The Harwick estate was not fully settled. The probate records in Sacramento show the 2 nephews as the legal representatives of the holdings. An attorney who knows probate and contract law should be able to establish a claim against those holdings on the basis of the ledgers and the correspondence. The letters demonstrate that Harwick knew the debt existed. The ledgers demonstrate the amount. The fact that the records were concealed rather than destroyed is itself significant. Clara said she did not have money for an attorney. Nora said she owned the property where the documents were found. I am prepared to provide testimony about the conditions of the discovery and the chain of custody of the materials from the point at which I removed them from the cellar floor. That establishes the evidentiary foundation. What you will need an attorney for is the filing and the negotiation, and there are attorneys in Carson City who take cases of this kind on a percentage of the recovery. Clara looked at her across the table with the same evaluating look she had shown at the door. She asked why Nora was doing this. Nora considered the question, not because it was difficult, but because she wanted to answer it correctly. She said her answer plainly. "Your father's hand is in those ledgers," she said. "He confirmed those figures in his own writing. The cellar floor that held them is the finest floor of any kind I have ever worked on, and whoever laid it understood their trade. It seemed right that what was hidden under that floor should benefit someone rather than remain hidden. It was not the whole answer. The whole answer included something that was harder to articulate. something about the kind of patience that her father had practiced and taught her, and how that patience eventually arrived at what had been sealed and waiting. But that part of the answer belonged to her, and she kept it. Clara nodded once. She reached into the open ledger and touched the blank page below the line. A lawyer in Carson City named Whitfield agreed to take the claim on a 15% contingency and filed the papers in the territorial court in November of 1889. The Sacramento nephews, who had engaged no representative in Nevada during the 11 months the estate had sat unsettled, engaged one very rapidly when the substance of the claim and the nature of the documentary evidence became part of the filed record. Their attorney reviewed the materials over 10 days and then advised them, Nora was told later, that settlement was the only reasonable course. The settlement was reached in January of 1890. The figure wasn't recorded publicly because the nephew's attorney required confidentiality as a condition, and Clara agreed to the condition because the amount was sufficient, and she had no interest in the nephew's humiliation. What was owed had been 30 years in the waiting. The settling of it was its own resolution. Garrett, the mine supervisor who had spoken at the auction about the bad foundation and who had been among the men who laughed, passed Nora on Copper Street in February and said nothing. He looked at her and then looked away and kept walking. She found this to be its own kind of acknowledgment and left it at that. The house at the north end of Copper Street did not require as much repair as the men on those steps had believed. The foundation had settled at the northeast corner, as she had seen from the outside, but the settling was stable and had not progressed further in the years since the house was vacated. She reinforced the corner footing with new stone, cutting each piece to fit the existing coursework, and repointed the above-grade courses through the spring. The east wall received new sill timbers in April, and by May the house was sound. She was not certain through much of that winter what she intended to do with it. It was a larger house than she needed for a woman on her own. It had good light in the morning and the kitchen faced south, which her father had always said was the correct orientation for a kitchen, and the cellar floor was the finest floor of any kind she had ever stood on, laid 30 years ago by someone whose name she had never learned and who had understood their work completely. She stayed. In the years that followed, she took on masonry work throughout the hollow and the surrounding territory, always the more precise kind, the kind that required training and a practiced eye, the work that got sent for when the thing had to be correct and not just adequate. She was not the only stonemason in the county by the early 1890s, but she was the most careful, and careful work is what gets sent for when the ordinary work has already failed once. She expanded the cellar workbench along the south wall and organized her father's tools in the order he had always kept them, from the heaviest to the lightest, each one cleaned and oiled before it was hung. The pointing chisel, the wooden mallet with the cracked face, the level with the hand-ground bubble, the cold chisels in graduated sizes. She added to them over time as the work required, but she kept his tools separate and did not mix them with the ones she bought herself, because they were not interchangeable and she saw no reason to pretend they were. The 2 flags near the south wall she replaced herself, fitting them back with fresh mortar she mixed to the formula her father had given her, lime and sand in the correct proportion, and allowed to cure for 3 full weeks before she set anything on them. The joints she cut clean with the pointing chisel, raking them to the correct depth and tooling them flat. When she was finished, you could not tell from looking at the floor which flags had been lifted and which had not, which was the correct result. The floor was what it had been before she arrived. Clara Draper came to the house once in the spring of 1890, not on any particular errand, she said, but to see the cellar for herself. Nora brought her down with a lantern and showed her the vault and the floor. Clara walked the length of it once and stood at the south wall for a moment, looking at the replaced flags. She asked if the cases were still here. Nora said no. She had given the cases to Whitfield for the legal filing, and they had been part of the evidentiary record, and he had returned them to Clara along with the settlement documents in January. Clara said she knew that. She had them in the cedar chest. She stood for another moment looking at the fitted stone floor in the lantern light. Then she said that her father had told her once that he had been cheated, but that he could not prove it, and that he had carried that without resolution for the rest of his life. Nora said nothing. Clara said her father would have known what this floor was. He would have understood who built it and why. She did not say anything further. Nora held the lantern and let the silence be what it was, which was sufficient. The drain in the cellar floor ran clear, the first good rain of April 1890, carrying the snowmelt from the foundation's north side out through the wall drain and into the kitchen garden in a clean sheet that spread across the March frozen ground and then soaked in. Whoever had laid that drain had calculated the fall correctly and had cut the channel to the correct profile, a wide, shallow V rather than a narrow trough, so that even the slow winter seepage found its way out without backing up. Nora stood at the cellar door and listened to the water moving through the channel and thought about the kind of mind that makes that calculation 30 years before the water that tests it. The red shawl she had worn to the auction and wore through the rest of that winter in the hollow was her mother's, the one thing she had carried from her father's house that had belonged to someone before him. It was heavy wool, the color of dried brick, and it held warmth longer than any coat she owned. She wore it in the cellar on the cold mornings, and she wore it the first morning she stood at the east window of the Harwick house, which was her house now, watching the sun come up over the ridgeline and the long shadow of the building fall across the frozen yard. Her father's tools stood in their leather roll on the workbench, cleaned and oiled. The pointing chisel he had sharpened so many times that the steel was thinner than it had begun, and still right. The wooden mallet with the cracked face that he had refused to replace because it had the weight he trusted. The level, its bubble hand ground by a glassworker in Pennsylvania, whose name she did not know. Trued against a plan board in the old way, and still true. She had not built an estate cellar of her own yet, as of that first spring. She thought she would eventually. The Harwick house sat on ground that went deep enough, and the substrate she had found when she repaired the northeast corner footing was solid granite at 6 feet, which was the correct depth for a foundation that would hold without moving. Her father had taught her to read the ground for that quality, the way you read everything else he taught her, by pressing your palm flat against the exposed face and feeling what came back. If it is cold and does not give, he had said, it will hold. She pressed her palm against the south wall of the cellar on the morning of her first spring in the house, and the stone was cold and still and did not give. She held her hand there for a moment. Then she took it away and went upstairs to make coffee. And outside the window the sun had cleared the ridge, and the yard was bright. And the cellar below her was exactly as it had been before she arrived, minus 2 cases and 1 horizontal line in heavy ink, and everything below it that had been blank. Have you ever uncovered something that turned out to hold far more than it appeared to? Leave a word below about what it was you found, or what you thought was empty that turned out to be full. There is another story waiting here, about a woman who opened something the world had given up on and found it had been holding the truth all along.